Joining us now from Washington is Dr. Walid Phares, an advisor to the U.S. House of Representatives Caucus on Counterterrorism and is Co-Secretary General of the Transatlantic Legislative Group on Counterterrorism. He's author of 4 books, including Future Jihad, Terrorist Strategies Against the West, and he's here to help us to understand the types of strategies jihadists use against America, the causes of America's failure of understanding terrorism, why there's a clash in strategies between the mindset of the West and the mindset of the jihadists, and whose strategy is prevalent today, and what those strategy differences are, and what we should do as a country to protect against future attacks. Dr. Phares, thank you so much for joining us. Most, if not all, Americans know who bin Laden is. Everyone knows about 9/11. Countless dollars have been spent on the war on terror. The question is this: should we assume that America is aware of and prepared for jihadists, and when I say jihadists, I mean the extremists, who are strategically positioning themselves to move against the U.S., or is the target that the U.S. is focusing on to combat terrorism a calculated diversion coming from the enemy?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a great opportunity to interact with your team and with the viewers and listeners around the world. As far as the question, it is very important in the beginning of any analysis about whom we call the jihadists, or basically who call themselves the jihadists, al-jihadiyun in Arabic, to understand what is that web. We're talking about a web of networks that has started in the early 20s with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the Sultanate, the Caliphate. A number of movements rose from Arabia and from Egypt in the Middle East, and then later on in South Asia. They call themselves the Salafists. And the Salafists have a very simple goal. That is to bring down 21 Arab countries in modern times, their governments, and instead establish what they call the Caliphate or Al-Khilafah. And of course, as a second goal, what would be to rule these provinces under the Caliphate under full, tight interpretation of Sharia law. This is what they say in their literature and in their views. Now, the jihadists have evolved around the Middle East, and of course, decade after decade, those who were influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood, Ikhwan al-Muslimin, and those who were influenced by the Wahhabis, and then there were offshoots and offshoots. It's a very long, interesting history. Now, to answer your question, most Americans do not know what I have just said right now. So if you don't know the history and the ideology and the goals of the jihadists as a people, as a nation, not as 200-300 experts who are serving either the private sector or the public sector, but as a nation. I mean, the nation knew very well what the ideology of the National Socialist was in World War II. Most Americans had an idea about what the Bolsheviks or the Marxists were during the Cold War. The difference between now and the previous worldwide confrontation is that most Americans do not know what and who the jihadists are. Therefore, I can answer comfortably and say that the United States as a whole is not yet fully prepared for a confrontation with the jihadists, simply because its public is not prepared. Therefore, I conclude here, we are 11 years or 10 years after 9/11. The debate about jihad, the one you conduct on your channel, is amazing, because 10 years after 9/11, there are still scholars, not just regular people, who think that jihad is a yoga, is a spiritual experience only. They don't even acknowledge the fact that it is an ideology and there are strategies that tries to implement it.
Very good. If the strategy of a terrorist or jihadist is created within the boundaries of his ideology, like you just said, why doesn't the U.S. work harder to understand the ideology, accept that it exists, number one, and then build strategies based on the understanding of how they think, instead of sticking with our own westernized version of strategy and tactics, which we proved on 9/11 failed?
Well, simply for a government, the United States in this case, to engage in an ideological confrontation, as was the case very clearly with fascism and Nazism, with the Soviet Bolsheviks and other totalitarian ideologies. This presumes that multiple decision-making processes in the United States are in the same direction. This presumes that the legislative is aware of it, that everybody in the executive is aware of it. That assumes also that the, judicial powers are aware of it, because when it comes to court, we need to address it and understand it. But more importantly, Samar, is that the classroom, the academia, where basically experts are coming from, is aware of it, recognizes it. I mean, the drama that we're living in the United States is that we do have battlefields. Out of Afghanistan, we had one in Iraq, and now the jihadists are rising in Yemen and Somalia and the Sahel, and even the battlefields of the homegrown jihadists. We do have all these battlefields for many years, and yet we do not understand that behind these battlefields there is an ideology. So the greater effort is going to be to go from minus 50 points to 0. We're not even at 0. And the minus 50 points to 0 is the battle of education. We need to educate Americans about the existence of that ideology, and then we have the luxury of discussing even the strategies of these jihadists.
Very good. And in your book you sort of talk about this, about subversive jihad. If part of its jihadist strategic approach is this subversive jihad, where they essentially use their enemies' resources, which in this case is America, as well as its governing laws to support further and even protect their efforts, what kind of hope is there to prevent them from infiltrating in this country?
It's awareness. The only hope that we have to stop subversion, let's call it strategic subversion, is to have additional numbers of Americans who are aware. If you're fully unaware, we lost the battle. We lost the war. We lost the confrontation. If you compare it to military strategies, and the jihadists do adopt strategies that are very close to battlefield, but in the war of ideas. In the military strategies, if any army, any expert will tell you that, does not have a radar, does not have AWACS, does not have intelligence to know what is the identification of that foe, we're going to only know about the foe when we will meet him in the trenches. I mean, let me take a couple cases. Abdul Muttalib, the Nigerian jihadist, who was about to blow up an airliner over Detroit. And had it not been for a Dutch citizen to stop him, there would have been the most cataclysmic disaster after 9/11. Now, why were we not aware of Abdul Muttalib's intentions, that he is carrying out an attack against us, the fact that his father went to the embassy, that he has been traveling to Yemen and everywhere, simply because we've ignored his ideology. Now the question is, how do we know about this ideology? Guess what? He was blogging about it. So the question here is, I would say, why is it that America and the national security apparatus of America is not equipped to detect the ideology of the foe, so we could basically preempt what that foe is trying to do against our national security?
And of the 6 tracks you say can be detected in the jihadist strategic approach, in your book you say economic, ideological, political, intelligence, subversive, and diplomatic jihad. Which of these has the potential of creating the most damage here in the U.S.?
Samar, it's a coupling of 2. One is the ideological. Without the ideology, the jihadists cannot operate. Against all the arguments of many in academia and research, some in government and some in public sector, who say, well, the jihadists are jihadists, or they are undertaking this action because they are upset with American foreign policy. But guess what? There was jihadism before American foreign policy. There was jihadism before the Arab-Israeli conflict. It is an ideology. It's a doctrine. Of course, they react to American foreign policy. So I would say without the ideology, the jihadists cannot function. But they need something else. They need basically subversion. They need to make sure that you and I, American citizens or citizens of the world, do not understand that they have a jihadist. So the essence of the battle that we are facing now is that foe, strategically, is trying to make everything they can for average Americans not to understand that there are, ideologies behind that, and therefore we can detect our strategy. It's a very sophisticated system.
And that's why it's so crucial, I assume, to recognize how the jihadist reads the mind of America. Is that right?
Absolutely. Actually, speeches by bin Laden, Ayman Zawahiri, Abu Mus'ab al-Suri, the guy who put a manual of 1,000 pages on internet. We need to read that. And even Sayyid Qutb, that I'm sure your show has been discussing for many, many days and hours, all of these ideologues and strategists of the jihadists looked at how we think. They understood that we have weaknesses. And the major weakness, Samar, is the fact that we have not been educated by our own experts, by our own teachers, of the existence of that threat. And therefore, they are taking advantage, i.e. the jihadist ideologues.
Okay, before we have to go to break in a few minutes here, but I see a flaw in our governing laws when jihadists can make extremist statements and claims against America, and yet at the same time are protected by freedom of speech. And at most, what do? We profile them from afar, and we wait to see if and what their next statement is, or try to see what their next move might be, so that we can use it against them in our court of law, but based on what? Based on our long list of politically correct requirements to do so. Is that being too simplistic?
No, actually, I would think this is very complex, what you just said. Basically, other liberal democracies, let's say Germany, France, and England, and these are very liberal democracies, probably more than us, in the sense of strict protection of civil, liberties in society. They have stipulations because they understood the threat. In France, they call the Islamists, les Islamistes. In Germany, they call them with their name, the jihadists. There are stipulations, but those stipulations are based on the fact that the jihadists are committing something which is more than expressing their views. And to be very clear about it, if an individual say, I want a caliphate, what's the problem? Have your caliphate. If I want to, do this, if I consider these people the infidels, it's not about expressing what you feel about the issues. It's about inciting for a collective action of violence. That becomes basically under our laws. But we have enough laws. What we don't have, we go back to square one, awareness. Congress, our lawmakers need to obtain awareness. And the battle that we see now, the experts are trying to inform lawmakers about this, and you can see a pushback from a lot of lobbies who do not want lawmakers to even hold hearings about this ideology.
Well, we have to take a short break. When we return, we'll continue our discussion on jihadist strategies against America. We'll also talk about root causes of America's failure in its war of terror. Our lines will soon be open, so give us a call at 248-416-1300. We'll be right back.
You are watching ABN.
Jihad has come to America.
Constitutes the most devastating series of terrorist attacks in history.
The only deen Allah accepts is Al-Islam. And whoever seeks any other deen apart from Islam will never be accepted.
We stand together to win the war against terrorism.
But you too will make your destruction.
Welcome back to Jihad Exposed. Quick announcement. March 22nd, Robert Spencer, Dr. Zufti Jasser, and Walid Shubat will join us in a debate on whether Islam can be reformed. And for those of you who missed the riveting debate just a few weeks ago hosted by political analyst Majdi Khalil with Dr. Wafat Sultan and Dr. Tawfiq Hamid, that's in Arabic for those of you who speak Arabic. Tomorrow night at 10:30, we will be rebroadcasting the highlights of that debate. If you missed the debate, you have to watch tomorrow night at 10:30 p.m. It was definitely worth watching, a very heated debate. Let's get back to tonight's topic right now. Dr. Phares, does America still believe that jihadist efforts are merely a reaction to foreign policy decisions, or does it understand that, yes, there is a goal to undermine the West by this group of people?
The majority of those whom we call the experts, meaning those who teach on campus, those who are the analysts, and those who are opinion makers, who have influence in what we call the mainstream media and who advise large segments of bureaucracy, I would say, they project that jihad is in fact, or jihadism, or even violent extremism, that's the way they call it, or terrorism in this case, are all reactions to our foreign policy. And as I said earlier, to the Arab-Israeli conflict, to us going to Iraq, to us going to Afghanistan. What they miss to explain to the American public is, even though the jihadists of course react to our foreign policy, everybody reacts to other foreign policy. They have an ideology of their own. The problem, the challenge in America is that there is an intelligentsia which is arguing, trying to educate the public or indoctrinate the public that there is no such thing as an ideology, it's just a reaction. If we change our policy, these guys will become liberal, Democrat, conservative, anything else, which is the flow.
Mm-hmm. So then why has America failed to reach a conclusion on the thinking mode and the application of the strategies devised by these jihadists?
Well, that's a very long, difficult question to answer, but I'm going to try to summarize it the best I can. Jihadist propaganda or their strategic communications has been able over the past not just few years, but maybe 3 decades to penetrate our systems, the deepest possible that would be in the educational system, and has been able to reach the academia, and within the academia, the classroom. Let me be very clear on this issue because it's very important for our viewers and listeners. Mm-hmm. There have been dozens of millions of petrodollars who, after 1973, through now, have been invested on our campuses, not in medical studies or engineering studies, but in Middle Eastern studies, Islamic studies, political science. And the purpose of that is basically to influence how we teach the young Americans who are going to be the analysts, the legislative assistants, the writers in New York Times, the writer, the journalists at NPR, is going to teach them the Middle East. And what was missing in that teaching on purpose, I would assume, is the fact that there has nothing been said about the jihadists. So from the actual center of how America thinks, should it be its, intelligence community, its defense community, the media in general terms, all the way up to high decision-making processes, there is a gap. And that gap basically has started in academia.
And if the U.S. didn't have enough knowledge to protect itself against 9/11, obviously, how do we know whether or not it has enough knowledge today to equip itself against a future 9/11? Is it considered a matter of national mobilization, or have we fallen back asleep as now almost 10 years has gone by since the attacks?
I don't think we are now falling back asleep. I think that in our defense and national security apparatus, there is a fantastic work by many people, the experts and specialists in terms of detecting activities that would resemble the 9/11 activities. Meaning, if the next 9/11, God forbid, will look like the old 9/11, it will have very low chances that have units coming from abroad trying to penetrate our countries, moving explosives, moving all kinds of weapons. We are becoming much better than that. We have greater technologies. The problem that we have is that the homegrown jihadists, those who have been indoctrinated on the inside of our country, who are U.S. citizens or U.S. persons, and who basically are part of us, of all of us. And we've seen a series over the past months, years, of this new type of threat. That is what we're not prepared for.
And on that, does the U.S. see the entire picture in that sense in terms of terrorism, or are we just fighting what we see and we're just reacting to the attacks themselves?
There's a very tiny minority of people who see a very large picture, and then it's like a reverse pyramid. Mm-hmm. And then there's a larger group of people who see, a larger picture. But most of us in the public and then in the bureaucracies do not see the big picture, simply going back to the issue of awareness. That's why what really needs to happen in America is an acceleration of awareness. We need to go so fast in creating the widest awareness possible, and that would be the real response to the threat of terrorism today.
Now you say pre-9/11, the U.S. viewed bin Laden as a vague security hazard, but certainly not a national threat pre-9/11. Yet it seems today we're still heading in the same direction with our defense down when we see jihadists as a vague security hazard and not a national threat, just like we did with bin Laden. Is there a flaw in that conclusion, or are we heading in the same direction as we did 10 years ago?
Well, for our viewers, just a reminder of when Osama bin Laden, in February of 1998, just a few months before he ordered the strikes against our 2 embassies in East Africa, when he delivered the longest declaration of war against the United States, I expected the next day to see Congress and the President to discuss this issue. Mm-hmm. The next day, mainstream media, maybe the New York Times on I don't know what number of page, their conclusion was that this is a Saudi dissident upset with U.S. foreign policy, or maybe some would say was upset with social justice in Saudi Arabia. That had nothing to do with the fact that he was leading an all-out jihadi strategic campaign against the United States. What we have now is something similar, but in other grounds. Now we are saying, our officials are saying, that the threat is Al-Qaeda. We're going to destroy Al-Qaeda, we're going to go after Al-Qaeda. But Al-Qaeda is the name of an organization. What if they change their name and call it 17C? So it's not the enemy. We need to identify the foe in terms of ideology and agenda, what they say, what they intend on doing, not, an ID card.
Mm-hmm. And how effective then can America's defensive and even offensive strategies be if it fails to equate that ideology of jihadism with terrorism?
Well, jihadism is the ideology that can produce terrorism. Jihadism could operate also outside the norms of terrorism. It could do political subversion. It could actually do indoctrination and radicalization. Jihadism has multiple dimensions. And as you just said, Samar, in the beginning, jihadism could operate, 80% of jihadism could operate under our laws. Right. So it's an ideology which basically, like National Socialism, in the early stages, was operating under the constitution of the Republic of Weimar. Then they took it over. What we need to do right now is basically enable the public to understand what it is, and then the legislator to understand what it is, and then the executive branch with its defense and national security agencies could basically, based on that awareness, design the best counter strategies. And I would say we have two areas of interest here. One is our homeland, and we need to have adapted strategies to the homeland, different from overseas. And of course, in the choice of our allies around the world, that would be the international battlefield against the jihadists.
How has America's strategy towards terrorism changed since 9/11?
It has developed tremendously in terms of technology. We are very much advanced in protecting ourselves from the Muhammad Atta type of units, Ziyad al-Jarrah. That we have progressed. Two, in basically taking the fight to the battlefields around the world. I mean, one cannot measure how important that was, that we actually are in Afghanistan pinning down a lot of forces by the jihadists, that our task forces are around the world, that we are coordinating with potential allies, including NATO. All this is positive in the fight against the jihadists. Where we have not made any advance, and that's to our detriment, is the fact that although in the first few years after 9/11, high-ranking officials, including the president at the time, have mentioned the fact that there is an ideological threat in speeches. In our national security doctrine, that is the mother of all our activities in terms of counterterrorism, versus it has been going down over the past 2 years, maybe 4 years, I would say, whereby we are limiting our enabling of our citizens to understand where the threat is, and that is the downside of what we have been doing.
And with that, what is one major difference in the strategy of a jihadist versus the strategy of the West or of America? And then also, if you could take us quickly through the standards of success from each group. Do we have one unified standard of success in war against terror?
No, actually, that's a very good question. We and the jihadists have different views on how do we measure victory. Mm-hmm. We are very quantitative. You often hear U.S. officials or European officials or international officials talking about how much damage we inflicted to Al-Qaeda, the upper tier, the middle tier, how much we have been able to deny them to have sanctuary. All of this is, in terms of measurement is true. But what we don't realize is that every time we're inflicting some sort of damage, Al-Qaeda's ideology is producing another Al-Qaeda and a third Al-Qaeda and a fourth Al-Qaeda. Mm-hmm. I mean, by way of comparison, we had all Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan. We took it out. Mm-hmm. We have 5-6 potential Afghanistans in Somalia, in Yemen, in the Sahel, even here at home. Mm-hmm. So the view of the jihadists is different. It's how close they are from bringing down our will as international community, as the United States, to fight them, mm-hmm. because if they can shut us down, basically, they can rise in the Middle East and reestablish all these emirates. So the measurement is way different between us and them.
And how much global support and followers in the Muslim world do these Islamists or jihadists have? And do they actually need global support in your mind to carry out their operations?
Let me begin with the last segment. Yes, of course, they need to feel that there is a very large global, we'll see, but very large support within the regions where they operate, that's the greater Middle East, the Arab and Muslim world if you want, and beyond. They need to see that for their ideologues to tell them you are supported by your people. That's why they put a big emphasis on media, on propaganda, on satellite TV airing programs that would say, Hayya ala jihad, let's, you are on the right path. And of course the internet, the chat rooms, all that debate is very important for them. Now, first segment of your question is about, quantitatively, how many are there? We don't have, nobody has real numbers. What we have are estimates, and the estimates are the results of indoctrination that the mother movements, not just Al-Qaeda, the Wahhabis, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Deobandis, the Salafi Takfiris, all these streams of Islamism that can transform itself into jihadism have obtained worldwide. The estimate is somewhere between 5 to 7%. That's the most conservative estimate of the influence that they have worldwide.
Very good. We will take a short break. When we come back, we'll start to take your calls, and we will also ask Dr. Phares what the guidelines and prescriptive policies should be for America to prevent a future terrorist attack here in our country. Our lines are 248-416-1300. Give us a call. Again, 248-416-1300. We will be right back.
وأسأل الله أن يرد كيد الكائدين وأن يدمر اليهود ومن عاونهم من النصارى والشيوعيين وأن يجعلهم غنيمة المسلمين، أن يحيي الجهاد، ونحن نقنت عليهم كل ليل وكل سجدة أن الله يبيدهم وأن يمزقهم وأن ينصرنا عليهم.
You are watching ABN.
Jihad has come to America.
Constitutes the most devastating series of terrorist attacks in history.
The only deen Allah accepts is Al-Islam. And whoever seeks any other deen apart from Islam will never be accepted.
And we stand together to win the war against terrorism.
Welcome back to Jihad Exposed, our last 30 minutes before we take our first call of the evening. Let me ask you, as we're sort of wrapping up on what the West needs to do to protect the country, what steps does this country need to take, first of all, to define the enemy? Because you said earlier that we have a problem defining who our enemy is. What should we do?
Well, there are some very clear steps to follow, I would suggest. Number one, that this Congress would basically engage in long-term, very serious hearings about the actual ideology of the enemy. I mean, we're going to bypass the debate right now to the real series of hearings on the ideology. Once we have established a document in Congress, then that should be sent to the administration. And I will call on the administration to form a next commission after the 9/11 commission, the Commission on Future Threat. And that commission will have people with real expertise, multiple ideas, and then the administration should put a document for the entire American public to say, what is the ideology of Al-Qaeda? We're not even going beyond Al-Qaeda. Just let us know what is that ideology. Once that is done, I guess, we can go internationally and align as many allies against this specific ideology. And don't be surprised that not only in Europe, but even in Russia, in India, and even in the Arab and Muslim world, you could find the allies if you define the enemy.
Very good. Why don't we let our viewers have an opportunity to ask you their questions and see what their comments are for this topic. Let's take our first call of the evening. You're live here on Jihad Exposed.
Good evening. This is Dar, and my question is for Dr. Phares. And Dr. Phares, my question goes back to originally when you were mentioning Germany, France, and England as basically being able to identify the enemy. And if you think, sir, like some people do, that Western Europe is lost at this point.
Well, I think that Western Europe, and I am, referring to Western European intellectuals and historians have been saying, they are in a much dire situation than we are here. And it's because of the fact that the jihadist networks, the Salafi networks, have penetrated Western Europe much, longer than here, in the sense that we saw that in France, for example, and French National Security Services, French analysts are telling us that their belief is that within France they are not in the hundreds but in the thousands, and they've got a test about that in 2005, although it was seen at the time that these incidents were urban incidents. But a deeper analysis of it saw that there is the imprint of a jihadi network. Britain, for example, is, their authorities are monitoring 1,500 jihadists of the kind of Muhammad Atta and Ziad al-Jarrah. Germany also is in a dire situation. So Western Europe, with regard to threat, probably is in more difficulties, but they have something else. They are more aware than us. Their governments are daring to use a terminology that our government, this government, is not using.
I hope that answered your question. We're going to go right to our second caller. You're live. Welcome to the program. Welcome to Jihad Exposed.
Hello, Mr. Dr. Walid Phares. How are you?
Welcome.
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you. Go right ahead.
Okay. I have a question to Dr. Walid Phares. I know him, Dr. Walid. My name is Theodore, Dr. Walid. I am a Syrian from Iraq. The question is that many years we complain to United States, British, they break promise to my people, Muhammad Phares, my people, help Syrian and Iraq or everywhere. The Mr. Churchill from today too, Tony Blair or other, they break his promise, fasting, same thing. We will complain to Mr. Pope. Mr. Pope, no, I didn't pay attention about my people at all. Everybody look for patrol. From today, Lebanon, Beirut, my people there are Moranis, there are situations that nobody help them. The question is, how long will it be like this? Whose fault? Patrol side, or human rights, no justice, and no war. This is my question, Dr. Walid Phares. God bless you. I love you. I love everybody. My people are Syria. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. Go right ahead, Dr. Phares.
Thank you very much for this question. This is a history question. This is a drama question, and he's right on target when he mentioned that many of these ethno-religious minorities, and to be very specific, the Christian minorities in the Middle East have been actually abandoned by the international community, by democracies. We've seen the cases, from Iran to basically Iraq over the past decades. Syria, Lebanon is a great example. We had many shows on your station with regard to Copts, but also Sudan, and not just the Christian minorities. Look at the Berbers, Amazigh in North Africa. The issue of having, minorities that are oppressed, or national, ethnic, religious groups that are oppressed in the Middle East, and the West unable to or not responsive, I bring it back also to jihadism, in the sense that oil-producing regimes, those who are funding the spread of this ideology, have tremendous influence in the United States and the West, specifically since 1973 oil boycott. And it's, let me put it in one short sentence, it's because of oil influence that the minorities in the Middle East have been abandoned. I hope this is going to change with the democratic revolutions or the revolts that are happening now. Hopefully they will become democratic revolutions.
What should Homeland Security do differently in terms of understanding the jihadist strategies in order to protect this country?
Well, first of all, there should be a national security doctrine on jihadism. Once we have that document, and let's bring everybody who wants to say anything about it, those who criticize and those who are going to give us, enlightenment about it. The problem is that there is a refusal to discuss it. I served on several boards, including in 05, 06, on future terrorism, and on other subcommittees, either in, with agencies under the previous administration and bureaucracy, or subcommittees and caucuses with Congress. And the missing thing is that there should be a admission or a recognition that there is an ideology, and we should not panic about the fact that there is an ideology. We should just admit it, and then bring in all those who can give us good advice on how to roll it back. I know that many people are saying, this is how you handle the situation, but they refuse to say this is an ideology. It's very, very simple. It's the first grader question about this is the ideology, and that therefore there are multiple roads and ways to counter it.
do you think that we'll ever get to the stage where we all do, after we get in the same room and we have the debate, that we'll all agree to the definition of that ideology and what to do in order to not allow it to seep through our country?
To me, if we can get to a room and recognize that we're dealing with an ideology, it's enough. We are at point zero. Now we are at minus 80, minus 50. Once you say there is an ideology, and I give the example from the Arab and Muslim world, because many here counter-argue in America and say, you know, we can't use those words because the Arab and Muslim world is going to react. What are they talking about? I mean, you know many journalists who go in the Arab world, in Arab media, and what kind of words do we use there? We use jihadism, Salafiyya, Khomeiniya, Jihadiyya. So the Arab world is not shy about talking about the ideology. So why are we here in America?
Right. And quick question based on what you said a little earlier on the Muslim Brotherhood. Is our country at risk, or how at risk is our country when our president recently had been criticized for not necessarily condemning the Muslim Brotherhood? I mean, where does that put us as a country?
Well, look, I mean, I am positive in my approach. I would say let Congress first begin by discussing what is the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood, and then what is the strategy of the Muslim Brotherhood. Then let's take it to the administration. And as I said, the best way to do it, let the president appoint a 9/11 commission-like gathering of experts. Even if one expert is going to say the Muslim Brotherhood has a jihadi ideology, at least the American public would hear that note. Now that we're not hearing it. Now the maximum that the public speech talks about is extremism or violent extremists. What is a violent extremist? It could be everything. Mm-hmm. So we have to be more specific so that the public and the Arab and Muslim world start to understand us much better than before.
But even the American world has you're right, has not gone so far as to understand the ideology. But reading out just their motto, that motto alone does not sound like a secular motto. It sounds like a radical motto. So why can't we use that as a basis for just basically understanding, like a third grade level, this is their ideology, or this is their motto. It certainly does not sound like a secular motto, and for us to right away go and not take it as seriously, or our president, I guess that's the perception that the American people have.
It all depends not just on general education. You have people who have PhDs from Ivy League schools who do not understand what the jihadi ideology is. So they don't have that chip of jihadi studies. And you have people who don't have that much education, who have read about it, who understand what it is, and they have a higher level of understanding of this specific issue. So my concern is that we need to do the education in the classroom. There is no escape of that. If Americans are told on NPR 24/7 or on mainstream media or read it in the newspapers that jihad is yoga, you could pile up as many documents saying this is what the verses said and this is what Al-Qaeda said, and they're not going to get it because the chip is not there. The educational chip is not there. It's a battle of education.
Is this country's current defense strategies strong enough to forecast and ultimately prevent a future rise in unification of jihadists who, of course, aim to turn this country into an Islamic State?
No. No, for the simple reason that the jihadists are able to penetrate our defenses. I'm not talking only on the military level, but on the political, ideological, and beyond that. And they are at a speed which is, growing. The pool of the jihadists in this country is growing. And we can see it clearly in terms of how many attempts against our national security. That's the sampling. It's like a blood sample. You can see that it's growing there. But the good news is that in the national community, in general terms in America, you see more and more people who are aware of it. We are probably an estimate of 10 million people versus probably 100,000 in before 9/11 who understand that for a myriad of reasons. Even within the communities that are originating from the greater Middle East, you see even a greater understanding of that threat. But the microphone is not yet in the hands of those who can beam that education and information. What we do is just private initiatives to try to educate the American people.
But if the country continues with its current strategies, which you say is not enough, are you saying that there is a possibility that this country will in the future become an Islamic State or will be attacked by these jihadists if we don't change anything in our strategy?
I don't think that this country will become an Islamist, Taliban-like state, for the simple reason that there is a benchmark whereby if the jihadist goes too fast and engage in confrontation too wide, then they're going to trigger a reaction by the American public in general, even within the communities where they are. People are going to turn against them. So what is also an advantage to the jihadists could turn as a disadvantage to them. But in order to be able to stop that from happening, we don't want to go in an era whereby the jihadists can strike in all cities and everywhere, as could be the case in the Middle East. We need to basically curve up the problem, stop the problem, contain it before it becomes really a disaster.
But do you think that the same mindset of Osama bin Laden, who was successful in attacking this country, that same mindset, do you think that they would be intelligent enough to time their infiltration in a way where the American people or America or the West is not noticing, is not smelling something wrong? Because like the last caller said, it's already been infiltrating into Western Europe, and it's becoming, we see Islamization there. So how do we know that it's not going to come here if their timing is right on?
This is a question of a historical dimension. And I will only answer by referring to a debate that happened between the jihadists in the fall of 2001. One representing, it was on Al Jazeera, one represented the views of bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, and the other one represented the views of those who are, Islamist, but not supportive of Al-Qaeda. They want to do the long-term penetration jihadism by ideological means and not by violence. And what the long-term Muslim Brotherhood, let's call it, strategy said, the guy said, Osama bin Laden basically did a disfavor for us. We have been building our infrastructure, penetrating liberal democracies, penetrating America, in the sense that he was saying our causes were receiving a lot of support. And you, bin Laden, came in 20 minutes and destroyed all of that. We have to come back and then rebuild everything. The guy from Al-Qaeda said, oh no, when we provoke such kind of actions, we're going to end up, at the end of the day, bringing down the national security of the United States. So there is a debate among the jihadists themselves on the issue.
And with that, let's take our next caller on air. Welcome. What is your name and what's your question?
Okay, my name is Nicola, and my question is, why don't we blame the source of Islamic jihadists, which is the Quran? Are we afraid to put our fingers on the Quran and say this is the source of jihadist ideology? Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. Go right ahead.
Well, in national security, we can't do that. In government relations, we can't do that. In a secular democracy, that's what it is. You can actually not go to whatever text that is, religious or not, in national security and say, this is responsible for that. In national security, you say, these are forces, the jihadists, that are organizing themselves. They refer to text or they don't refer to text. That's their own problem. Once they bring themselves to harm us, then they are under the light of national security. What the gentleman is talking about is something different, and we need to begin making that distinction. A cultural, ideological debate and theological debate among, people who are part of the intellectual confrontation, it could take its course. And actually that has happened in the Arab and Muslim world some 1,000 years ago in Baghdad between various factions about the Quran, about the Hadith. It happened in the Christian world. It happened in many other religions and civilizations. So I would make a clear distinction between a theological debate, and you could blame whatever you want against whomever you want, and then national security. It operates differently.
But at the same time, okay, I agree with you that we cannot touch a religion or attack a religion in and of itself. But a jihadist uses their interpretation of their religion, and they're applying it to the political world. And what they're doing, and that political link, that political aspect is what is undermining the democracy and the very principles that this country was founded on. So why can't the U.S. see that link and then bring it to justice?
Seeing the link intellectually where those jihadists are bringing their, their references is something that anybody can do. We don't even need the government. I mean, this is open country. You could discuss anything you want. And anybody who wants to stop you will be against the Constitution of the United States. That's one thing. Now, if the jihadists are bringing concepts from whatever level they're bringing it and putting it against our national security, and I'll give you one example, very clear example. If they start to divide Americans on practical terms between, infidels and non-infidels on the kuffar, then the concept of kuffar becomes political. I don't care where it's coming from. Many people have sent letters to the Secretary General of the Organization of the Islamic Conference asking that organization, OIC, you've got to be very careful about the concept of kuffar. If you apply it in the real world, you are creating an apartheid in society. If this is confined to the world of theology, fine. It's like Gentile and not Gentile and believers and not believers. This is an open market of ideas and religion. But if you bring it to the actual reality of the world, this is where government, national security, legislation could intervene.
Very good. Let's take our next call as we wind down the show. Who do we have on air with us?
Liz?
Welcome, Liz. Go right ahead.
Hi. Dr. Phares, I was wondering if you think perhaps it's more productive for us to boycott oil companies, to try and get the oil companies to stop, giving the money that finances all of this?
Very good question. Go
yes,
ahead.
It's a very good, very practical question. Actually, eventually, once you have a public which is aware of the problem, and then a Congress which reflects the awareness of the public, then the executive branch which should be reflective of all of that, then we have to have strategies that would free America in general terms, not just from oil. I mean, the question is not economic, from political economy, from the political use of oil. Meaning, if those regimes who are using the dividends of oil instead of feeding their own population, and now we see revolutions everywhere. This discussion next year may not be even valid at this point in time. But we need then to have a discussion, a real discussion with oil-producing regimes and telling them, if you want to use the dividends of oil, the financial dividends of oil, to promote radicalization, then we have a problem with you. We're going to buy it from somewhere else, or we're going to shift our economies to something else. And it may need a lot of effort, and it may need many years. But that discussion will have an impact only if we have an American public, an American Congress, and an executive that are in line, like planets in line, with the same awareness.
Very good. And in the last 20 years, would you say that there is a rise in the number of jihadists globally?
Oh, absolutely. Those numbers are now beyond any numbers they were before. I'm not going to compare to the 20s. I'm comparing to the 70s and the 80s. And it's very clear. We can measure that online. We can measure it in vote. We could measure it in many other places. But the good news, I always like to bring in some good news. The other side of those societies where the jihadists are growing, there is a rise of the counter-jihadists, of young people. And what is interesting, Samar, is that the youngest are not as jihadists as those who have already been indoctrinated. Look, for example, at the demonstration in Iran, 1.5 million people, 60% were below 20. The majority of them were females. That's very indicative.
And finally, I just want you, if you can, for our audience, to wrap up not necessarily only what the U.S. can do moving forward, but why it's so important to understand the mindset and the mentality of a jihadist in order to keep them out of this country, or even the ones that are in our country, to find out where they're at, bring them to justice, and get them out.
What has to do with justice is anybody who is organizing anything against the national security of the country and of citizens, regardless of race, religion, anything. It happened that the jihadists are organized. It happened that statistics tells us that over the past, few months and years, we have had an escalation in a number of those who describe themselves as jihadists, from North Carolina to Illinois to Texas, everywhere. The numbers are very clear that the jihadists are mushrooming. Hence, it is very important for citizens in general, citizens of all the communities, including the Arab and Muslim and Middle Eastern communities, to be aware, to be in the front line of the battle of awareness. And the more American citizens, all of them, regardless of creed, religion, and race, the more they read about it, the more they interact, with this show, the more I think the country will be healthy in its resistance against terrorism.
Thank you so much, Dr. Phares, for joining us. We certainly do appreciate your wealth of knowledge and intelligence in this matter. We hope to invite you again soon. For those of you who want to learn more about Dr. Phares' organization, go to walidphares.com, where you can find out more about his books, including Future Jihad, excellent book. We thank you so much for joining us again.